All right, we have moved into the Christian scriptures now, the Greek New Testament. And first thing we want to look at, which makes sense because the whole reason for the Christian scriptures, the Greek New Testament, is the person and the story about the person of Jesus. And first thing we want to look at then is the accounts of Jesus' life. And one of the things that surprises people that don't know anything about biblical literature is that we have not one but 4 accounts of Jesus' life. As anybody that's spent any time in Sunday school knows, you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now you can go to Sunday school and not learn that the first 3 of these are called the Synoptic Gospels. And that's basically our focus for this week. I wanted to take a look at one account. It's actually not even an account. It's just sort of a transitional phrase. And I'm going to read from Matthew 4:12. Okay, and this is right after the temptation of Jesus. Okay, John the Baptist was baptizing. He baptizes Jesus. Then comes the temptation. Then comes this. Matthew 4:12. Now, when Jesus heard that John had been taken into custody, he withdrew into Galilee. Well, that's pretty simple stuff, right? When Jesus heard that John had been taken into custody, he withdrew into Galilee. Okay? Mark says in 1:14, now after John had been taken into custody, Jesus came into Galilee preaching the gospel of God. Well, it's different, but it's the same. And by the way, this comes right after the preaching of John the Baptist, which is what Mark begins with. He doesn't tell the story of Jesus' birth. Right after the baptism, and then right after the very brief account of Jesus' temptation. Okay, what did it say? After John had been taken into custody, Jesus went into Galilee preaching the gospel of God. Okay, now you could say, well, that sounds kind of like a different thing, but I mean, it's the same thing, but told in a slightly different way, slightly different words, but really it's very, very similar. Luke is a little bit different. This is in Luke 4:14. And this comes, shockingly, after, let's see, well, what do you know? John the Baptist is preaching in Luke 3. And then Jesus is baptized. Then Luke adds the genealogy of Jesus, which Matthew had at the very beginning, and Mark doesn't have it all. And then we have the temptation, and then later in that chapter, Jesus' public ministry. And Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread throughout all the surrounding district. Okay, well that is worded differently. It says nothing about John the Baptist being arrested. But you can see that all 3 of these put things in exactly the same order, and they include mostly the same things. And if they get them in, if they get something else in there, like Luke has the genealogy, they at least get the things that are there in the same order. Now you might say, well, hey, of course they're writing about the same person. Why wouldn't they get it in the same order? But people throughout the years have read these Gospels and have said, no, it's obvious that these 3 are very similar. And the consensus among most of the scholars these days is that Mark was written first, and then Luke and Matthew had access to Mark, and they sort of used Mark as one of their sources, but they used other information as well. Is that what happened? I don't know. Is it possible there was an oral tradition? Possible. Is it possible that God inspired them to write exactly the same words? Well, that's possible, I suppose. That seems to me kind of a stretch, and I'd have to say, well, why didn't he have them write exactly the same words? But it's possible. Are there other possibilities? Sure. Is it possible Luke came first and then Mark drew on Luke? That's possible. Lots of things are possible. And if you want to earn a PhD in biblical studies, you can write the definitive new explanation of how what they've said for years is completely wrong. Here's the way it ought to be. But realize you're going to be swimming upstream in doing that. I don't want to get into it all. I don't really think it's all that important. We can read the stuff regardless of how it might have come about. But what we have to agree on is that there are some striking similarities, And so when you see striking similarities, you have to say, well, I wonder why they're different where they're different. What happens when Mark puts this detail in or Luke leaves this detail out? How does that make things different? And that's one of the things that I'd like you to pay attention to as we go through this material. I think that's all I have for today. So we'll end there. This is week 14, and we are getting within sight of the finish line, but lots of great stuff to go through before we finish. So have a great week.